Romans. Last week, we heard a little bit about Romans chapter 1. And I'm going to get my slides up here. And we looked at it from Paul's perspective as somebody who had been persecuted, right, by those who sought to woo God, whether they be Jewish or Roman or pagan or whatever, to woo God for the purpose of social cohesion or peace or good standing in this world or whatever. When you don't play by those rules, when you don't participate in the actions that keep things running smoothly, then probably you're going to be hated or looked down on. You're going to become a scapegoat, the bane of society, things like that. So Paul was involved with that himself, right? He persecuted the early church because he was in that wooing place at one time. Then he had the epiphany and he realized, no, that's not the right way to do it. So Paul makes the point that it's actually, if you remember this, it's actually worse, though. Like yes, you're going to be persecuted and things are going to come your way if you don't play by the rules, but it's going to be worse if you do because it leads to all kinds of dehumanization and degrading practices and things like that. And that's what we kind of heard last week. And the reason that he opens with that is it really sets the stage for a kind of universal feel for humanity, right? He's going to come at things from a very broad perspective because remember, the whole point of this book, the goal, is the community where everyone dwells together in love and harmony so that the world can be on that path. So Paul, he right from the get-go shows that the problem of trading God for an idol is a problem for everybody, right? Jewish people and pagan people do it too, and that's what we heard last week. So chapter 2 really picks up this theme, and it begins to get really specific with it. And we'll see how these points really fit together and will play into the larger argument that Paul's making. And it's a point that we'll all be able to learn from as well. There's some pretty direct connections we can make to our lives from today's texts. The format today is going to be a little different than what I normally do. I'm going to take chapters 2 and 3, and we're going to just break them up into kind of naturally occurring sections, basically by paragraph. And we're going to look at the whole entirety of that text. I'm not going to read it word for word, but I'm going to have it up on the screen. So kind of like, remember back in the day when people would bring like paper Bibles wrapped in leather to like church, and then you would have it open in front of you and you could see the text that the preacher was from. So even if you didn't read it, you could like kind of see it. Remember that? That's how I was raised. I actually like paper Bibles. I just actually bought 2 this week. So anyway, the point is, I'm going to kick it old school. You're going to have the text up here, whether you have a Bible on your phone or in your lap or what, so you can kind of like see the text that we're working in. But I'll just be unpacking it. Let's dive in. Chapter 2 opens with Paul saying, basically, hey, based on what I just said, right? Based on the chapter 1 stuff you heard, of course there's no chapters, but based on these like previous things I just said, there's no excuse for you to be passing judgment on another person, especially if you're doing the same things. It's kind of an unexpected move, unless we remember that the whole point, again, of the book is to keep a peaceful, thriving harmony between Jewish and non-Jewish Roman Christians. So he opens up with the discussion we saw last week. God's goodness is known to all. God's goodness is freely given. To say otherwise, to introduce rituals, whatever, will lead you into all manner of inhumane acts. So his very next point then, opening of chapter 2, is that because the truth of God is for everyone, then none of us can stand in a place of superiority. None of us can stand in a place of judgment over someone else. Judgment meaning like making a decision of someone. Like you are in the wrong, you are in the right. You cannot decide on behalf of somebody else because of this universal thing we're all under. So, to say, I declare you to be unjust, I declare you to be evil, you're in the wrong, you're in the right even, neither group gets to tell the other group that. And then Paul makes the point that it's especially true when you're doing the very things that you're saying are not supposed to be done. Nobody likes a hypocrite, right? Like, in culture, that's one of the most off-putting things of all. If someone is kind of high and mighty and saying to another group of people or an individual, like, oh, you shouldn't be doing this, and here's why, and they're doing the exact same thing, everybody hates that. Nobody likes that. It's a very infuriating kind of action. And Paul points that out. He says, like, it's insufferable, really. He makes the point that it's an affront to the kindness of God. He says, you're standing in judgment over and against someone else, but God's not even doing that, right? That's not how God is presenting himself to all. So why are you doing that? What gives you the right to do it? Now, this brings us to a really interesting point, and it's something that we have to understand, and we're going to unpack it even more fully in a few minutes, but we have to understand something. Very often when Paul's writings are looked at, right, especially the texts that deal with the Jew and Gentile relationships, so Romans and Galatians, they're kind of framed in this law versus grace type mentality, because that's Paul's language. But the idea, it's often framed this way. The Jewish people thought that following God would earn them forgiveness, like following the law would earn them forgiveness, or would earn them a right standing before God or something like that. And Paul is here to tell us, no, following the law is not important, and that God's salvation, which typically is framed as forgiveness for personal moral failings and access to God, whether it be fellowship or heaven or something like that it's based on grace opposed to law. But that framing actually just misunderstands Second Temple Judaism and the way it was functioning, and therefore it misunderstands what Paul's doing. So right here in the beginning of chapter 2, it's important for us to remember, I mean, you can read it here, that Paul's specific point right now to the Jewish community is not that they follow the law and think it earns them something. It's that they're not following the law, right? So the problem is not, hey, you're following the law and you think it's making you better. He's saying, you have the law and you're not following it. He actually just wants them to follow the law. You're being a hypocrite. You say that you're following Torah, but you're not. So let's keep going a little bit and we'll see how Paul unpacks that. He continues on in this section by setting up kind of a two-way of life thought. It's extremely common for rabbinical thought. It makes sense that Paul would use it. It's very common in the Old Testament. Specifically, like the greatest example, one of my favorites, is Psalm 1. There's two ways of life, two paths you can take. The one is righteousness. The other is wickedness in Psalm 1. Righteousness will give you a depth of life, right? A tree with roots that's being fed by water. You'll be stable, you'll be secure. The wicked, the unjust, they're not so, right? They're not grounded. They're just like chaff blowing around in the wind. They don't last for 100 years like an oak tree. They just blow away and disappear. So Paul sets that stage with this two-way living type thing. And he kind of sums it up in verses 9 through 11, where he says, there will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil. Okay? Kind of like the chaff. Trouble and distress. You're not going to last. Things that come your way will just tear you apart. First for the Jew and for the Gentile. Then verse 10, but there's glory, honor, peace for everyone who does good. First for the Jew, then for the Gentile. Because God does not show favoritism. So verse 11 is really in many ways one of the main points of Romans. It comes up over and over. God does not show favoritism. God does not play favorites. He doesn't decide things randomly. The sun rises for everyone, as we saw last week. So Paul, the rabbi, would say, look, the created order is built on justice and peace. It's built on love and empathy. It's built into the created order. And so if someone lives according to those principles, great. God's not going to say, oh, you're Jewish and you're living Torah, so I'm going to bless you. But you're Gentile and you're also living Torah, but I don't like you as much because you're Gentile. No, Paul's like, if you align with the moral arc of the universe, like to use Martin Luther King's word, if you align with the moral arc of the universe, then great, you're in line, you're in order, things are going to be fine. If you don't, you're going to be kicking against the pricks or whatever Jesus said to Paul at that point. It's going to be a struggle for you if you're not in line with the universal law of things. He takes it a step further then, because there's an important point he pulls out of this. He says that it's not those who hear the law who are righteous, but it's those who obey the law. That's pretty interesting, right? It's because, again, think about maybe times that you've heard Romans used for someone to say, oh, Paul would never, like, in order to be declared to be in the right, in order to be declared righteous or on the right path, you have to do nothing, or there's no works, or whatever like that. But Paul literally says, it's people who obey the law who are right, who are doing the right thing. If Gentiles accidentally follow the law, he says in this section, then that's enough. It shows that the law was written in their hearts. That's all that matters. Paul is saying God is big enough that the spirit behind Torah can guide anybody. It could guide a Jewish person, it could guide a Gentile. There's no distinction. This is why he then addresses the Jewish thought specifically in the next section. And he says, if you're Jewish and you don't think you don't think that there's some kind of like advantage before God, or you have a sense of superiority because you have the truth of Torah, but you're not living out the beautiful life that Torah was meant to point towards, then ultimately you'll be even worse off, right? So this is what he says, like it comes up again in Romans, that the law condemns those who are under it. Because if you're given this law, and the law was meant to show you a beautiful way of life, like justice, it's meant to guide you in righteousness, it's meant to guide you towards peace, and you're not doing those things, right? Then someone who never heard Torah, but is living justly and leaving parts of their grain for the poor to pick up and all of this stuff, but never heard of Torah, those two lives, when they come together, this Gentile who's living Torah kind of like condemns the Jewish person who's not living Torah. Not that they are actually standing in a place of judgment and making a decision, but their life exposes the hypocrisy of the one who is given the law and doesn't do it. This is Paul's point. And it's all meant to unpack this sense of superiority that the Jewish community would have because of their law following. He makes the point that he's like, since you're given this law, and you have this life that it lays out, but you're not living this life, God's name is blasphemed among the nations. It's a pretty important point because I think that we see that a lot in our culture, don't we? Like, I see all the time, social networking, news media outlets, things like that, where a person who is admittedly non-Christian, right, a person who does not claim to want to follow Jesus in their life, looks at a set of Christians or a Christian individual or a church or something and says, hey, I thought your book says to love your neighbor as yourself. And a lot of us don't like that. We're like, oh, wow, it's hypocritical to point out hypocrisy. You're doing the same thing. But the Pauline answer would be like, yeah, no, you're right. If you're given some good way of life and you tout it and you don't do it, you stand in condemnation before the people who observe you. It's easy to point out that hypocrisy. That's where we need to start, is what Paul is saying to the Jewish believers. In order for us to really grasp how this is going on and Paul's view of the law, we're going to do a little sidebar, a Romans reorient, taking contextual clues. Do you like that? Doesn't that flow? 2 R's, 2 C's. We're going to be discussing something called covenantal nomism. Okay. Nomism means using the law. The Greek word for law is nomos. Right? So nomism is following a law, adopting a law as your way of life. Covenantal nomism then would be using the law in the context of a covenant. Now, the Reformation kind of evangelical, Lutheran Calvinist kind of idea of Judaism, from whence a lot of this theology arose, was that Judaism in the first century, the Jews around Jesus, the Jews around Paul, Paul himself before he converted, the idea was that people who looked at history thought that the Jewish people said to themselves, oh, I am unworthy before God, and I do all these evil deeds, but if I do enough good deeds, they'll outweigh my bad deeds. Right? That's called merit theology. My merit will earn me some sort of favor before God and will kind of like erase my bad things. More good, like a scale. But that's not what first century Judaism believed. It's not. It's a misunderstanding. To impose that on them is a little unfair. And from this, there's this whole debate over like law versus grace, right? And as we've talked about, Luther looked at that and said, oh, the Jewish people believe that. And that's what the Catholic Church is teaching. And they were very merit-based. And so he used that to argue against the Catholic Church. But the problem was, that's not first century Judaism. They did not view Torah from a merit theology system. They held the law within covenantal nomism. And what that is this. soundly purred happily. What that is this. The Jewish people, if you read rabbinical literature, did not have any sense of a personal salvation. It's not in their literature, right? If you read evangelical literature, that's the whole main thing, right? A personal relationship with Jesus, that's very touted. We stand condemned individually, we can be saved individually, and then earn some sort of glory individually, go to heaven or whatnot. But for Judaism, there was no sense of am I personally right before a holy God who's angry at me? Because they were given the Abrahamic covenant. For a Jewish person, they assumed they were in right standing with God. It was the assumption. It was the natural way of life, right? They were given a covenant. And, by the way, if you read the Old Testament and most of rabbinical literature, that was an act of grace. Over and over, Yahweh is quoted as saying, I didn't choose you because you earned it. I didn't make you my people because you're better than other people. I just did it out of loving kindness, patience, mercy, all these various things the Old Testament talks about. But the Jewish community believed it was from grace that God had given them the covenant. The way the law functioned then was not to bring you into the covenant, to bring you in good graces, but rather to keep you as a good standing member of the community, because being in the community was what determined your standing before God. Jewish community, good, right? So being in community, good. Torah keeps you in community. So even sacrifice and food laws and circumcision have to be viewed through this perspective. They're not ways to basically get points with God. They're ways to keep things running smoothly in the covenant. Now, the reason why this is important is, let me check my notes. Is it important? No, I'm just kidding. It is. What ended up happening in Paul's time, right? And this is what Paul has to deal with a lot. This is what specifically Galatians is about, but it's what Romans is about too. What ended up happening was that the Torah, and specifically certain aspects of the Torah, food laws and circumcision, these two became for the Jewish community kind of badges of honor, right? So you were circumcised not because you would have said, oh, God will be angry if I'm not, or God will be pleased if I do, but rather, this proves I'm a Torah follower. How do you know I'm a Torah follower? How do you know I'm in the community that is accepted? Because I'm circumcised, because I don't eat pork, because I don't eat shrimp, etc., etc. And they became badges of honor that were worn to show that they were a part of the special in crowd. We have to keep that in mind because the whole law versus grace kind of thinking misses the mark. Jewish people knew they had grace. The problem was not that they thought they were earning salvation. The problem was that they didn't know how wide grace actually was. They didn't know that somebody could be outside of the circumcision community and still experience grace. So these covenant markers are what Paul is dealing with, which really helps us then to get back to the text, make sense of verses 25 through 28, because suddenly he begins discussing circumcision and its value. Where does that come from? He's talking about this universal stuff, and he's saying, if you follow the law, if you say you follow the law, but you don't, you're a hypocrite, and it makes God look bad and all this stuff. And then suddenly, circumcision is of value if you obey the law. But if you break the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. What is he even talking about? He's saying, yeah, you're right. Jewish community who's wearing badges of honor, who has identity markers. It's fine to show that you're a Torah-type person, right? It's fine to wear the team's hat or the jersey. But if it's stepping beyond that, then you've lost it. He says, if someone who, and by the way, if someone who doesn't wear that jersey is living Torah's spirit, then that's just as valid. Because these are matters of the heart, he says. Circumcision is a spiritual, not literal thing, as you see on the screen. He says, whatever marker is given to show that Torah following is happening comes through the Spirit, the breath of God, the movement of God, the freedom of God in the world. It's not merely adhering to the code, to the letter of the law, but tapping into the Spirit that stands behind the law, giving the law its purpose and its beauty. That brings him then to the next point, which is what we call chapter 3, where he says two things. Does being Jewish have any advantage? Yes. And then the next paragraph he says, does being Jewish have any advantage? No. He says both things. He says yes and no. To make sense of how these play off each other, we understand that it's different reasons. He's like kind of playing with the words. He says, first, yes, of course there's an advantage. And he's a rabbi, right? And he was proud of it. He liked it. He says, of course it's good to be a member of the people who were given the covenant. Why? Because you witnessed God's grace and kindness. And he says, basically, look, let's be honest. We Jewish people, and he includes himself here. He doesn't always in Romans, but he does here. He says, we Jewish people have always kind of been on the wrong side of things. Like, God's always upholding the covenant, and we literally never are upholding the covenant, and yet, God's mercy and kindness is still shown. We've never really pursued justice, and yet God still desires justice. Which is why he then says, there's actually no advantage, if by advantage you mean some kind of higher standing in the community. His point is that the Jewish community saw truth and beauty, but there's no reason to think of themselves as superior, because at the end of the day, they're the same as all the nations. Why? Because of Romans 1. And because of this, he kind of reiterates it. Nobody's any better off than anyone else. We've all taken this invisible God, and we've all put him into idols, images, ideologies, theologies, right? We all break God down. We all are full of deceit. We all hurt each other. We all do all of these things that clearly show that we're missing justice. So ultimately, there's no claim to be made for superiority based on whether or not you're Jewish. So, quick recap before we do our final section and our close. There's an intended world where we're meant to live, where we thrive with depths of life as we live together in peace and harmony and love. 2, that life was intended to be shown to us through Torah, but ultimately is for everyone. And it's possible for someone to capture that Torah spirit even without wearing the badges of honor of food laws or circumcision. In fact, God shows no favoritism based on those works of the law. If you do wear those badges of honor in superiority, but miss the spirit of Torah, you've missed everything Torah was meant to be. That's Paul's argument thus far. We then come to verse 21. This next paragraph is so packed with so many terms that are commonly used, and they need to be unpacked. And it's the first time, notice, that Paul brings Jesus into the discussion. Right? In his opening to the letter, he says, like, grace and peace from our Lord Jesus to you, right? And I'm a slave of King Jesus. But he doesn't, like, bring Jesus into the discussion at all of how this is playing out with law. So this is super important. And I was planning on unpacking it all. That was the plan. But as I was writing, I was like, whoops, this is going to be way too long of a sermon. So next week, we're going to unpack this paragraph because it fits very naturally into chapter 4. So come back. You're going to love it. It's actually really exciting. Anytime Paul uses Jesus, it gets really crazy and fun. But for the discussion at hand, the main thing is clear. Basically what he does is he shows how Jesus fits into the fact that the life he's describing is for everyone, not just Jewish and Gentile. Which brings him then to the final concluding paragraph of our two texts. He says, where then is boasting? It's excluded. Because of what law? The law that requires badges of honor? The law that requires that you hold these works? No. The law, the Torah, same Torah, that requires faith. Because we maintain that a person is declared to be in the right by faith apart from these badges of honor. Is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles too? Yes, of course, Gentiles too, because there's only one God, right? Romans 1, big one God, who will declare everybody to be in the right, whether uncircumcised or not. Do we then nullify the law by this faith? No, we uphold it. This is what it's all about. This is the whole point. Can we boast No. All of Paul's discussion in 2 and 3 is to get him to the point where he can say emphatically, beyond a shadow of a doubt, there is no room for anyone to boast, to be in a place of superiority over somebody else because of what they've shown in their bodies. There is no place for that at all. Look what he says at the end. God is the God of everyone. Therefore, Torah is for everyone. It is not a badge of honor to hold against another group. And he ends by saying, even though I'm saying that these works of the law aren't putting us in the right place, right? Aren't the basis of us being declared to be doing the right things in our lives. Even though I'm saying that these markers aren't what it's all about, I'm actually upholding the law more than anyone else. And I'm not getting rid of it at all. I'm showing its true purpose, the beauty that it stands in front of, the spirit behind it that is for everyone and can guide into a good life. So now that we've gotten the context of 2 and 3, right, we're going to add 2 more points to our recap, for our final recap. Torah is upheld when we live in its spirit rather than on the surface level of written code. And number 5, boasting about a special place in God's covenant based on works of the law, badges of honor, is completely off the table, out of bounds. That's Paul's main argument for 2 and 3. So now that we understand that, we've got the context, we all know what covenantal nomism is, how first century Judaism was functioning, all that, right? We all got that. Why is it important for us today? Because I think none of us have debates over the place of Torah in our lives, right? I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, not any one of you in here follows Torah in any way, shape, or form. Not just the badges, not just the food laws, not just the circumcision, but any of the other ones pretty much. So then why is it so important, Paul's discussion of this for us? The mindset, the badge of honor, the works of a law that show our higher position in the in crowd, these are as alive as ever. And we must hear Paul's voice. I'm going to give you like a little example from my childhood. It's almost too explicit. I was trying to think of a story. John's telling me I need to tell more stories. So I'm trying to like think about stories. And I thought of one, but it's almost word for word Romans 2 and 3. I was like, it's just too redundant. But that might just show you how hard it's gripping some churches. I went to this church when I was in middle school. It's called Bethel Baptist Church. It was in Schaumburg, Illinois. We moved up there so my dad could be on staff there. And it was a very I don't know the word for it. It was strict or whatever, but it was, they had these kind of codes, basically, these identity marker codes of law that were very important to them. For instance, guys couldn't wear shorts, right? Like cut-off pants, shorts. Women could not wear pants. That one's fairly common in fundamentalism. I had never heard of the shorts one, though, before that. All manner of things. Of course, the main ones, smoking, cards, whatever. But like no shorts. Oh, hair had to be like, short, combed the right way on men, things like that. And these were like, it would be said sometimes, of course there are other churches who are still Christians. It would be kind of said like condescendingly. Of course there are other like believers. But we hold ourselves to a higher standard. That was their exact phrase. Like, we hold ourselves to a higher standard. And it became like a joke. Like, in the church community, it was said, like, if someone was complaining about something or had a question about if something was okay or not, the answer would be like, does it pass the Bethel standard? The Bethel standard was like this, like, slogan. And it totally was a badge of honor because I remember leadership, like adults, right, kind of making fun of other churches. It was like the largest fundamentalist church in the area, a couple thousand members. But there was this other church, I'm sure you've heard of this one, Willow Creek. It's like one of the main churches in the universe. And it was right down the road from us. And it was always like poked fun of like those Willow Creekers with their low standards, right? We have like such a higher standard, the Bethel standard. It was this like badge of honor that was like gave this sense of superiority. And sure, we're both brothers and sisters if you get right down to it, but they're not getting it. That is obviously wrong, right? And anti-Pauline, and has nothing to do with like Christianity as Paul is kind of laying it out. And none of us here are from that like really harsh fundamentalist background. This is the first Baptist church I've ever been in that was just so ridiculously open about so many things. And I'm not complaining. Trust me, I love it. But it was like shocking to me. And we don't struggle with like women wearing pants or whatever. But here's the thing. Evangelicalism, the broader American church, which is, for better or worse, the tradition we've emerged out of, has a lot of these identity markers and a lot of these kind of badges of honor that are worn, especially like in the political realm. There's a lot of examples, but the one that hit me this week especially was the pro-life stance, right? The pro-life stance of as far as being political. It's definitely an identity marker, and it's become kind of a litmus test for being in. Right? Like, what kind of Christian are you? Are the best kind of Christian? If you are, you'll be pro-life. You won't just be pro-life. You'll vote pro-life, right? Something like that. And I really feel like this is a good example because you could definitely just put the words right into some of these verses. I want to do a little thought experiment for a second. And I want you to think about if Paul was alive today, and I'm going to read this verse and see if it makes sense to you. I'm going to take out circumcision and I'm going to put in a pro-life person. A pro-life person is not the one who votes outwardly for the pro-life candidate or posts on social media. Rather, being pro-life is a matter of the heart. If someone votes for a different candidate, but works for the good of all around them, they condemn the one who votes but doesn't act. Therefore, boasting about it is excluded. Right? I think it works. And this is definitely one of the more hypocritical areas that have emerged in Christianity. That's an obvious one. I think we can think of more examples, and I hope you'll use breakouts to do that. Kind of like question, what are we holding as badges of honor over and against other kinds of people? You know, Christianity doesn't really worry too much about being right with God, right? The whole point, right, of Christianity is that we are right with God, like justified, declared to be in the right. We've built all these theologies that tell us we're okay. We've done X, Y, and Z, therefore we'll go to X, Y, and Z, or we'll have X, Y, and Z, or whatever. We're literally the exact same as Second Temple Judaism. Being in Christianity, you don't wake up and you're like, is God going to send me to hell? You know you've already got things pretty much right, but the law, the badges of honor, kind of help you stay on the right track or know that you're in. And so we must not fall into that trap. Because as Paul reminds us, if we have all of those things we tell ourselves, the minute we have a sense of superiority, Paul would say, those things become nothing. And he would actually say they don't just become nothing, they become harmful. Because eventually, where it leads you, Romans 1, Romans 2, it leads you to a place where you'll end up being closed off to others. You'll end up forgetting God is the God of everyone. You'll end up actually choosing against justice and love, actually working for injustice. And Paul's point is that can happen to anybody. If it can happen to the Jewish community, this is pretty abrupt for Paul to say, abrasive for Paul to say. If it can happen to the Jewish community, then it can happen in our community. So recognize the wideness of God's kindness, as Paul would say, and let go of any badge of honor, whether it be an action, a belief, anything else. I think the second point for us, too, is that we probably need to be the voice of Paul for our time. A friend of mine keeps telling me that he's more ready to proselytize than he's ever been in his life. And it's funny, because I didn't expect it. I think there's kind of an element of that, right? Like, when we come across a group of people or a movement or a person who's like trying to take Jesus and turn Jesus into a new food law or a new circumcision, a new badge of honor, when someone takes Jesus and makes Jesus another work of the law, we should be prepared to say, well, actually, no. God's bigger than that. You're narrowing things too far for people. Because, as we saw in chapter 2, God will be made known through actions. So we'll either find a God that shows favoritism and will be blasphemed, as Paul said, and rightly so that God should be blasphemed. Or we'll see a God who is for all, whose glory can fill all the world. So let's all work together to show that God. Let's pray. God, guide us in the paths of truth so that through us beauty, creativity, mercy, love, forgiveness, healing, and peace will flow through all the world. Amen. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took Passover bread and wine with his friends, disciples, and he said, every time from now on when you take this bread, every time you take this juice, do it in remembrance of me. Paul said the same thing, quoted that same text, and then said, because every time we take it in remembrance of Jesus, we show forth his death, the one that undoes the divisions between Jew and Gentile, was his actual point in that text. We show forth his death until he comes. So as we take this bread and juice together, contemplate the wideness and accessibility that is God's love, and let go of any badge of honor or work of the law that you believe keeps you in God's favor or keeps you above another person.